Good Shabbos. This week is Parshas Shlach, and I'm hoping to learn a lesson from the story of the Meraglim, of the spies, in this week's portion, and make it somehow relevant to the question that I posed in the title of this video, is will the Palestinians ever seek peace? Let me explain. There's two major sins that the Jews committed in the desert. One was when Moshe was late in coming down from Mount Sinai. The Jews started serving idols, and Moshe comes down. He gets very angry, we all know, broke the tablets. There's some punishment, but they continue on their path. Then there's the sin of the spies, that they say they can't go into the land of Israel because it's too difficult, and they're punished for 40 years. Which is a greater sin? Which sin is graver? Is it the one of idolatry, or suggesting that it's too difficult to conquer the land? And why would the punishment be greater there? A simple answer, which is probably appropriate, is that if you say you can't conquer the land, God says, okay, you don't want to go into the land. So therefore, the punishment is appropriate for the sin. But I want to approach it in a little different way. And that's the following. There's two different types of sins. One is ideological, and one is attributed to our character and our personalities and culturally what we have learned. And the first sin was, of course, idolatry. The second sin is the fear, and the fear that would then be passed on for a generation, and therefore saying we have to wait 40 years, which we know is considered a generation because from 20 to 60 is when the men were counted as possible warriors. So that seems to be the generation that we're assuming. So wait 40 years when this generation passes, and the next generation hopefully will be able to adjust to the reality of, yes, we are strong enough to conquer the land of Israel. We could have faith and trust in God that'll help us conquer the land of Israel. So one sin is ideological, one is more practical. There's a commentary by Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, the author of the book Akedas Yitzchak, and he approaches the following problem. Abraham said to Yitzchak, his son, I don't want you to marry any women from the land of Canaan, but rather I want you to go back to my family and marry someone from my family. So he asked a very simple question. Avram left his family, and we assume it's because there was idolatry. And Avram had to leave that idolatrous practice, and he started the religion of Judaism and established monotheism. So why would he send his son back to a land where they're practicing idolatry, but he doesn't want to take a wife from the people that were amongst he lives because he says they are not moral? Basically, later on in the Torah it says, do not do the toevas, the abominations of Egypt or Canaan, and it seems to be referring there to sins of morality. So again, another answer could be approached, and you could say, well, it's different if you take someone from a foreign land and bring her here versus whether you're integrating into a family in the land of Canaan. Again, that's a legitimate, textual, simple approach. But what Rabbi Yitzchak Arama says is there's a difference between idolatry and character. Ideology could change. You can convince someone to change their ideology. You could prove to them, or they could change their basic beliefs. That's something which is changeable. This is what he suggests. But character, the morality of the people of Canaan, is much harder to shake off. And Avraham is saying, I don't want you to marry into a family which has bad morals. I'd rather you marry into a family which has bad ideology. We could change the ideology. It's much harder to change that ingrained culture and that the attitudes and the character traits which are part of the people of Canaan. And I think we could approach this perhaps to the question I asked before. And you could say that the Jewish people, they served idols. They'll get over that. They'll learn to trust God once again, that Moshe will come down, and they'll understand that they made a mistake. But the fear that they had and the attitude that they had about conquering the land, That's not something which is so easily changed. That might take a whole generation to change. Now let's try, this is just a suggestion, to try to apply this to the present situation in Gaza. And I don't have the answers, of course, just like many others don't have the answer. But we know that the Palestinian people generally are followers of Hamas. The polls show that a large percentage of Palestinians, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, support Hamas. And Hamas, of course, stands for the total obliteration of the Jewish people, and they're not seeking peace. There's no question about it. The Hamas leadership for sure, and those that follow seem to follow in that same way, and they're not seeking peace. But the question is why? Is it cultural or is it ideological? So it's quite possible that if it's ideological and religion-based, which it seems to be, perhaps it's easier to change according to the suggestion of the commentary I mentioned before. You could argue that that's not the case. You could argue that just the opposite, as many have said, that the religious beliefs are so ingrained within the Palestinian people and Islamic radicalism that seems to exist in Gaza for sure, that it's not going to be easily changed. But I think you could see that that's not the case. As I like to argue, the Catholic Church was not exactly the best friend of the Jewish people. But post World War II, it took a Holocaust, it took a lot of historical occurrences until it changed. But post World War II in Vatican II, the Catholic Church says no more hatred of Jews. And there might be some latent anti-Semitism within that Christian population. But overall, there's no more hate being espoused by the church, and we don't find that there's any movement to kill Jews from the Catholic Church. So we know it's possible. Now you could argue that it takes a generation too, because it didn't happen overnight. But it seems that that ideological stance was able to be changed. The question is really, are the Palestinians, is the anti-Semitism, that anti-Jewish thought, just an ideology, which maybe could be changed once Hamas has to be obliterated, and perhaps also Hezbollah, and maybe we have to deal with Iran, the source of this hatred. But it's quite possible that the ideological approach of the people will change when when perhaps history will move it in a certain way, when Hamas will be defeated. Maybe the ideology is only superficial, and they might sort of look for peace. But if it's cultural, if this radical Islamic philosophy has changed the culture and changed the attitudes and the character of the people, where they don't want peace, they only want war, they only want to hate the Jewish people, then we have a problem. So I don't know the answer. I think it might be an approach which we could think about, and I suggest at least that we could be maybe somewhat optimistic either of two ways. Either it is because of their ideology, and the ideology could change, and it's not ingrained, or the ideology or the ingrained culture could be changed, but it might take a generation. I'd hope that it would go faster than a generation, which is at least 20, 30 years. But it is possible. History shows that people could change their attitude. Nazism is gone from Germany. The imperialism of Japan and the attitude they had to foreigners seems to have changed. Again, what changed them was something very drastic. It was a nuclear bomb, complete defeat of the German army. But there are possibilities of change. We have to not just hope for change, of course. In the meantime, we have to do everything we can to make sure that Hamas no longer stands in Gaza, and that Hezbollah either will have to be destroyed or at least make sure that they're contained. Again, these are very complicated problems, but I think it's good for us to have a sense of optimism that there's a possibility of change. and hopefully that will come soon in our days. Good Shabbos.